I'm Lynn Dearborn, current president of ACSA. We began planning this conference pre-pandemic, envisioning the meeting as a chance to reflect on much of what we do, thinking about where the margins and centers are with respect to school communities for different member programs, but also how the relationship between diverse programs and their larger context of neighborhood, town, city, state, and country influence a school's culture and climate. In light of the pandemic world we've been operating in for the past 12 months, the conference theme has proven apt for many of us as we have navigated a changing landscape of interactions and renewed calls to reckon with embedded measures of progress and excellence coming from an inherited system of ideals growing from our history as a profession comprised largely of white, wealthy, cisgender males. Over the past year, I've learned from numerous Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx ACSA colleagues how deeply this racialized and gendered history influences much of what we take for granted as the way things should be. It has initiated much personal and collective soul searching for me and for ACSA's leadership and staff as we work to address equity within our organization's programs, procedures, and operations. I'd like to take just a minute to thank members of this year's inaugural Senior Advisory Committee on Racial Equity: Renee Chow, Sharon Sutton, Paula Sanguinetti, David Fortin, Lynn Paxson, and Brad Grant for sharing their collective wisdom and guidance. Their commitment to ACSA's efforts over the past year have prompted deep reflection that will continue to transform what we do and how we do it. We hope you'll see the influence of the conference theme as we move through the next 3 days of peer-reviewed sessions, proposed panel sessions, some networking time, and some plenaries that promise to illuminate the conference theme. We also want to take a minute to thank the numerous groups and people who have supported this conference and its development. Washington State University in St. Louis, we thank them for originally agreeing to be the host school. The Tau Sigma Delta Honor Society, and especially Michelle Reinhardt, for the continued participation of Tau Sigma Delta in the conference and for its sponsorship of the closing keynote. Lucy Campbell, President of the Association of Architecture School Librarians, and Nilda Sanchez Rodriguez, the Vice President and Conference Chair. They meet regularly in conjunction with ACSA's annual meeting, and this year they have an even closer relationship with AASL participating and annual meeting participants welcome and at each other's sessions throughout the conference. I want to thank Erin Conti, Sarah Takatatsu, and Karma Israelson from from AIAS, who are joining us through their Crit Live Scholars Program, which gives students experience doing research and presenting it. I want to thank the members of the annual meeting committee. It has been an incredible pleasure to work with 3 members of the steering committee, which is responsible for all the non-peer-reviewed content in the conference. Heather Woofter, who you'll hear from shortly. She's professor and director of the College of Architecture and the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Design at Washington University in St. Louis. Shannon Chris is associate professor of architecture at the University of Kansas School of Architecture and Design. And Nicole Wiedemann, who's an associate professor and director of the Professional Residency Program at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture. We've also had a second great group of colleagues responsible for the peer-reviewed content portion of the conference. And we'll introduce them tomorrow at our special short session focused on peer review in the discipline that will be led by Nicole Wiedemann and Corey Griffin. That session will begin tomorrow morning at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Throughout this conference, we've tried to replace the informal collegiality that we have when we're in person and that we miss in so many online platforms. In order to develop a bit more collegiality, I encourage you all to fill out the profile in the conference platform and to connect with each other. Before I turn it over to Heather to talk about the conference theme, I want to make sure that everybody is on board with how the conference's schedule is designed. We have several different kinds of sessions. We have peer-reviewed paper sessions that are 90 minutes long with presentations from the authors, and those are followed by Q&A. We have special focus sessions, which are panel sessions that last about 60 minutes. Many of these sessions reflect the conference theme. Each day, we've also set aside 90 minutes for networking and visiting with exhibitors. Today's networking time is from 3:30 to 5 Eastern. Visit the lounge to chat with colleagues, or you can join the St. Louis Architecture and Urbanism Tour. On Thursday, the networking and tour time is from 2 to 3:30 Eastern, and we have a special workshop about St. Louis's Fourthville neighborhood. Friday, the networking time is also from 2 to 3:30 Eastern, and we have a special 90-minute workshop called Grounding Mass Timber. So you have the opportunity either to engage in the informal interactions with colleagues or to attend a tour or a workshop during that 90-minute networking session. We have a plenary session each day as well. And in just a few minutes, you'll be watching today's plenary. Tomorrow, we'll kick off with a short session on peer review in the discipline of architecture. That will start at 10:30 Eastern Time. Tomorrow evening, beginning at 5:30 Eastern, we'll have our awards ceremony and the Topaz presentation. And then on Friday at 5:30 Eastern, we'll close the conference with John Paul Jones delivering the Tau Sigma Delta keynote. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Heather Woofter to talk more about the development of the conference theme. Thank you, Heather.
Good morning. I would like to thank Lynn Dearborn from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for her ACSA leadership, including her role in shaping this conference. Lynn's scholarship and service embodies the themes, and it was an honor to get to know her better through the event. I also want to recognize Shannon Chris from the University of Kansas and Nicole Wiedemann from the University of Texas at Austin. Our conversations around special topics and thematic content for the conference helped shape this introduction. Pre-COVID, we planned to be in St. Louis. The title, Expanding the View, was partially inspired by the fantastic Midwest views only possible from inside the Gateway Arch of St. Louis. Imagine looking over the expansive territory at the Missouri and Mississippi River system confluence, a region central to climate-related barometers in a Rust Belt American city with complex histories of racial conflicts and segregation. While the region represents many of the challenges highlighted in the 2021 annual meeting, St. Louis also signals optimism with growing number of partnerships in socially engaged and inclusive practices. Deep commitments from educational institutions like Washington University are needed to work in, for, and with local regions to guide us through long-term impactful change. We are not unique. Through education, we need to amplify a broader conversation outside the limits of design education and seek a diverse balance of educators and practitioners representing the demographics of the communities we serve. In our conversations, the steering committee considered the rapidly evolving social, cultural, technological, and ecological questions that urgently frame all of our work. The word prospect evokes a view of the future. What are the prospects for a transformative architectural education, considering our evolving context, and the emerging diversity of schools and communities. We have 3 sub-themes to the conference, and I'll share with you our collective thoughts. Effective interdisciplinarity. Historically, architects have tackled challenging and expansive disciplinary isolation problems, employing a designer lens and borrowing ideas from other fields. Complex contemporary challenges in public health, social relations, and technology demand interdisciplinary teams that call for us to rethink how we work together to expand the solution spaces. Transformative scholarship. As a group characterized as makers and doers, architectural educators often push traditional academic scholarship boundaries. This impactful work can change places and lives, but may not always receive appropriate acknowledgement. How might we offer future practitioners the tools to speculate and envision transformative solutions and bring practice innovations into the educational sphere? Equitable diversity. We understand that diversity among students and faculty on our campuses offers benefits for innovation through the infusion of distinct perspectives and ideas. Our programs must grow to be broadly accessible and inviting. How might we weave inclusive practices into our courses, curricula, and culture to embed equity and justice in architectural education and broadly transform the world around us? The focus sessions highlighted these themes, with conference speakers articulating spatial injustice histories, addressing the polarizing gaps in suburban communities, and how we better narrate these complex stories. Also, the sessions reflect and amplify diverse community voices and strategies for conducting fieldwork that underscore deeper cultural understanding. Educators address forward-thinking educational systems with the Student Experience Project and co-op models of architectural practice that leverage collective power. Lastly, a series of sessions centered on research, from the educational programs that support this culture to sustainable material explorations and speculative practices. The themes of the conference make visible generative and progressive values in architectural education, expanding our view. The Gateway Arch, a 630-foot-high catenary curve of stainless steel, an engineering marvel, was also the site of urban renewal, demolishing 40 blocks of blight-labeled property, eliminating businesses supporting 5,000 workers and historic cast iron building infrastructure. These mixed histories proliferate our regions, and they remind us that the themes of this conference are essential. Equitable practices to better represent the diverse neighborhood and regional partnerships, effective interdisciplinarity to bring collective knowledge to bear on vexing social, environmental, and technical challenges of today, and transformative scholarship to expand the impact of our work with local partners and in global concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Now, I'd like to introduce the panel for the Expanding the View of the Profession plenary, which I'll moderate. Jason Pugh is the 2021-2022 president of the National Organization of Minority Architects. He's a senior associate architect and urban designer at Gensler's Chicago office. A licensed architect and certified planner, Pugh manages projects that engage the extended community and end users, following projects from schematic community-based master plans through full construction. He previously served as the president of the Illinois NOMA chapter from 2015 to 2016, and served on the associate board of Chicago's Architecture, Construction, and Engineering Mentor Program. Pugh has a Bachelor of Arts from Howard University and a Master of Science in Architecture and Urban Design from Columbia University. Our next panel member is Tiffany Brown. She's the recently appointed Executive Director of the National Organization of Minority Architects. She's a co-founder of the Urban Arts Collective which focuses on increasing underrepresented groups in science, technology, art, architecture, and mathematics. Brown also created 400 Forward, which aims to identify the next 400 women architects with an underlying focus on African American girls through access to education about design. A passionate leader within NOMA and the architecture industry, Brown was recognized by the American Institute of Architects with a 2020 Associate Award for Outstanding Leadership and Creative Thinking. She was awarded similar honors from AIA Detroit and AIA Michigan in 2019. Brown held national NOMA board leadership positions and is also a founding member of NOMA Detroit. Previously, she worked at Smith Group and Hamilton Anderson Associates in Detroit. Brown earned her BArch and MArch and MBA from Lawrence Technical University. Our third panel member is Dr. Kwesi Daniels, who's the head of the architecture department at Tuskegee University. His professional experience ranges across various disciplines, including historic preservation, architecture, sustainability management, and urban geography. Over his 20-year career, he has worked for architecture firms and government agencies and projects around the country. He has also played an active role in the National Organization of Minority Architects, NOMA, the Alabama Black Heritage Council, and Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. However, his greatest honor has been to teach students at Tuskegee, Temple, NYU, and Columbia University in the city of New York, in addition to lecturing nationally. In 2018, he began developing a historic preservation program at Tuskegee University, which has resulted in the documentation of civil rights sites in Selma, Montgomery, and Tuskegee, Alabama. Professor Daniels earned a BArch and an MArch in architecture from Tuskegee University and the University of Illinois at Chicago, an MS in sustainable management from Columbia University, and in 2020, he earned a PhD in urban geography from Temple University. His doctoral research focused on studentification and its social impact on West Philadelphia neighborhoods. And finally, our fourth panel member today is William Collins, who's a 2020 Bachelor of Science architecture graduate of Florida A&M University. During the months of January to March, he has been a NOMA Foundation Fellow working at ZGF Architects. Throughout his time in architecture school, William hasn't quite had the easiest time finding real-world experience through internship or shadowing opportunities. Without fully giving up his pursuit for a chance to learn from industry professionals, he used his free time to brush up on some old skills and make some room for new ones. After being afforded the opportunity to be mentored by two of ZGF's best, Stephen Lewis and Otto Condon, it allowed William to dive deeper into how he can carve a space in the field that plays into his strengths and interests. So I'd like to welcome our four panelists.
How's everybody doing?
Hey, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Good morning.
I am going to begin by asking different panelists a series of questions, and then we'll have a few overall discussion points. And then I open it up to the audience to ask any questions you have in the Q&A box, and I will be able to see them. And if you see a question that you're interested in hearing more about, please vote for that question. It will rise up in the list, and I will work on those questions that are at the top of the list first. So I'd like to begin by asking Jason to introduce the audience to NOMA and to talk a little bit about the NOMA Foundation Fellowship.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lynn. Again, appreciate the invite, appreciate the platform and opportunity to share a little bit more about NOMA, our organization, the great work that we're doing across the country, and also our new NOMA Foundation Fellowship. So for those who are in the audience today and are maybe not familiar with NOMA, NOMA is the National Organization of Minority Architects, and it was formed nearly 50 years ago to represent the needs of African American architects. Founded in 1971 by 12 Black architects who met at an AAA conference in Detroit, some of them for the very first time, with the purpose to provide a network and support for a handful of Black licensed architects around the country, most of whom struggled against various forms of prejudice and discrimination within what was then, and if we're being honest, is still now, a white male-dominated profession. NOMA was formed for the purpose of minimizing the effect of racism on our profession, and today serves as a safe haven for architects of all origins who seek inclusion in the design industry. We continue for the increase in licensure of African American architects, as well as those from underrepresented backgrounds and communities. NOMA is extremely hopeful about the profession's bright future today, due in large part to our growing numbers of emerging students and young leaders that are now involved in the organization. I believe currently there are more than 80 plus NOMA student chapters across the US and Canada alone, and there are a number of professional NOMA chapters, which I believe is just shy of 35 chapters across the country, and we're continuing to expand every year. Now, while NOMA's one of our main goals and targets has remained focused on producing more licensed minority architects, unfortunately, that progress to that bold and audacious goal has remained fairly slow. Today, Black architects only account for just over 2% of licensed architects across the US, and historically, this number has unfortunately stayed consistent. As we all know, architects and planners are a critical piece of the puzzle. We have influence and control over the built environment and design how we live, work, and play. Architects have a role to protect public safety and reinforce the infrastructure and support lines that feed our cities, neighborhoods, and homes. And for these reasons alone, diversity and representation within these important roles is critically needed across our communities, especially when it comes to the development and growth of marginalized communities, in particular Black and Brown communities. In order to fill these inherent gaps, a deeper understanding of what architects and designers can do needs to start at a young age, and that starts with just exposure, education, and mentorship. So to this end, and in partnership with the AIA Large Firm Roundtable, we created the NOMA Foundation Fellowship to help increase the number of minority architects throughout the US. This program was started by my predecessor, the immediate past president of NOMA, Kimberly Dowdell. I believe it was towards the beginning of her presidency during a meeting at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. I believe the school had a very popular program, some may be familiar with, the U-Dream program, that helped attract graduates to the city by giving them early entry level jobs with firms and supporting them with housing and special programming. And Kim and the leadership team, noticing that NOMA didn't have much specifically geared towards new graduates, except for a free one-year membership to kind of bridge them between student and professional life, it seemed like a good idea to introduce a similar program for NOMA's new graduates and student members. As the program started to take shape, NOMA initially focused on supporting fresh college graduates and only in 5 key cities, but ultimately had to convert to a virtual format and expand the eligibility to all 4th and 5th year students just due to the global pandemic last year. The goal of the NOMA Foundation Fellowship, or NFF as we call it internally, is to pair minority architecture students with various mid to large size architecture firms to conduct both remote and in-person research fellowships, giving them access to mentorship and professional real-world firm experience. We have just completed the second cohort and have received high praise and positive feedback from all the participants in the program this year, both firms and students alike. And we plan to continue and grow this program in the future beyond my presidency and make it a staple of NOMA's focused programming for the next generation.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for that background and introduction. And I wanted to note for the audience that we have sort of a range of different educational backgrounds that you all came from. Jason started out at Howard and HBCU and moved into a graduate program at a PWI. And then we see your architecture degrees are a mix, and Tiffany's degrees are coming from PWI institution, and William is joining us. So with that, I actually wanted to ask Kwesi to give the audience a little bit more background about the HBCU experience, particularly the experience at Tuskegee, and he'll talk a little bit about Tuskegee's tradition of making, community engagement, and nurturing students.
Well, thank you, Lynn. So, Kwesi Daniels, I'm the Department Head of Architecture at Tuskegee. And as Lynn noted, Tuskegee is recognized as an HBCU, or Historically Black University. The C stands for college. And one of the things that has set our particular program apart through the years is that for African-American architects in mass, this is where architecture began. The first professionally trained architect in the country was Robert R. Taylor, who's also the namesake of our school. And he was trained at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which also was the first program in the country to begin teaching architecture. And so what that allowed us to do is tie our program directly to the first program of architecture. And the thing that makes Tuskegee very unique is the way that we went about training our students. So prior to Taylor's arrival at Tuskegee, Booker T. Washington had an educational philosophy that he called learning to do by doing. And the idea was that students would learn the process of constructing community and constructing a campus through the curriculum. So there wouldn't be a separate condition. It was, if you're going to learn math, you're going to learn science, you're going to learn the core components. If you're going to learn the building trades, you're going to learn that through the process of actually building the campus. So between 1881 and 1893, we began this building trade engagement very, very actively. Well, in 1893, when Taylor arrived, he brought architecture. And in that process, the understanding of how do you expand and you plan out the growth of your campus is something that he took under his helm and used the skills of architecture to teach students how to design the campus. And in conjunction with the students that were in the building trades, they built the campus. When I say built it, literally dug in the dirt and pulled out, the mud and turned it into bricks. And so we literally made our own bricks to turn those into buildings. And the thing that made that very unique is that for us, the method of instruction and construction was rooted in a building unit at the size of a brick, which allowed basically anybody to engage in that process. And so we had some folks who came to campus who had skills, and then we had some came to campus who had no skill sets. However, that unit of measurement made it possible for everyone to be involved. Well, the way that we translated that experience is that our students not only walked out with a theoretical understanding of what it means to design and build space, but they also walked out with a practical understanding, because most of our students were coming out of a sharecropper community. We're a large agricultural society. And so the curriculum was actually designed to meet the needs of the population. And that wasn't the curriculum we used was not one that everyone was using. It was, elements like, Latin and a strong liberal arts background was was still the focus of the time. However, Booker T. Washington realized that if we were going to provide an education that would grow communities, would help African-American communities elevate themselves, then the students needed to walk out with real skill sets that they could apply to their own local community. And so we can see that evidence when we look at the rural school building program that was taken under by our program under the guidance of Robert R. Taylor and esteemed scientist Dr. George Washington Carver, which culminated in what many of us know now as the Rosenwald schools, which were approximately 5,000 schools that were built throughout the Black Belt of the United States, from North Carolina to as far south as Texas. So and then we can fast forward, we can look at the civil rights movement. As a result of African-American architects who came through Tuskegee, many of the important civil rights structures of the 1960s, from the 16th Street Baptist Church, which was designed by Wallace Rayfield, to the Brick-a-Day Church that was designed by Walter T. Bailey. These were architects who were actually trained. Wallace Rayfield was trained at Pratt and Columbia, and Walter T. Bailey was actually trained at University of Illinois, was the first African-American graduate of U of I. But the thing that's important about it is because architecture has always been an apprenticeship model, just because you have the training does not mean that the education doesn't mean that you would receive the training, which is a condition that we still deal with today. And so Tuskegee was a place where Black architects could engage in the process and experience of actually doing architecture, and then could take that skill set out into the community where they were from, or other communities where they were called, and actually meet those needs. And as a result, Black communities all over the country were built because of that model. And so I can speak about Tuskegee specifically, but I know there is very similar translations of that ideology that you find at HBCUs, because our mission has always been to address the needs of populations, not just African Americans, but pretty much any other populations that's been marginalized and kept out of the mainstream capacity for education and engagement within professions in mass. As I noted, many of these architects graduated from majority institutions, we now recognize as PWIs, predominantly white institutions. However, because of their engagement at HBCUs, or the students that came to HBCUs, we still produced the largest number of African Americans in architecture that are coming out of HBCUs, even though there are only 7 of us. So what that means is that there's a tradition of providing voice and agency to marginalized communities that's devoid of focusing on ways to keep you marginalized, and instead how we look at how do we elevate you as a student. So at least on our campus, things as simple as not requiring a portfolio to gain admission into our program. You might say, well, you need a portfolio. Well, for many of our students, they don't know what a portfolio is, not because they don't have a body of work. It's just that was not part of the lexicon that they were exposed to prior to coming to school. And so if that's your first barrier to getting into school, into architecture, is that you have to have a portfolio, well, you might be the next Robert R. Taylor, or the next Walter T. Bailey, or the next Wallace Rayfield, who could have a significant contribution to society. But because you came out of a program in school that never exposed you to architecture and never exposed you to a term called portfolio, you didn't know how to translate the skills that you had learned, the great artistic skills or the drafting skills that you had gained in high school, into meeting the needs of architecture. And so that's just one way. And I hope over the course of the next half hour, we'll be able to talk about some of the other ways that we address these issues of educational inequity.
Thank you, Kwesi. Some of the qualities that Kwesi talked about are ones that all universities strive to have, but because of historical legacies, the cultures can be quite different. Tiffany Brown has her own experience as a student of color attending a predominantly white institution. I'm going to ask Tiffany to talk a bit about her experience in architectural education.
So I have a lot of thoughts on this topic, and the words educational inequity, the words exclusion are the ones that I usually speak about when just touching on my experience. at my university and in College for Architecture in general. So as Dr. Daniels mentioned, educational inequity is it's a thing. You know, it's not something that people think of. I'm not sure if a lot of professors think about this, but definitely it's something that I was not aware of until now. I was not aware of going into college not that many years ago. So I am a first generation college graduate. I was not quite prepared to go into a college, let alone to study something as rigorous as architecture at a private school. But it was just something I just kept telling myself that it had to be done. And I came from an inner city community here in Detroit, similar to the type of development that Jane Jacobs tried to stop Robert Moses from building. And then around that same time, Whitney Young made that speech to the AIA, where he stressed the importance of everyone doing everything that they can to address the diversity issue in our profession, or we're doing generations to come a major disservice. And I always say that I feel like he was speaking about me as someone growing up in that type of housing development and then switching seats of the table to working in this field, and also being an adjunct professor at my alma mater and trying to teach advocacy in architecture. So I did not have a portfolio when I started school there. I did not know the words elevation or scale, or had not seen one when I started school there. But I do remember many of my peers did. I do remember that it was not something that was a baseline of study. It was just kind of presented to the class as something that we were all aware of. And there were just days where I had to just go with the flow and really didn't know what was going on and didn't know what to do. So without the understanding of those terms and trying to navigate my way through undergrad, it was very difficult. So as I just tried to tread along through college, I realized that there were skill sets that I was missing, but there were some that I did. I was able to nurture. Growing up, I've always loved art. I've always loved creative writing. I had a woodshop class in middle school, but I had not been exposed to architecture as a profession until 12th grade. And so I didn't realize those things would be instrumental in helping me get through college, but luckily I did have those. So the educational inequity that I experienced at a PWI, I'm learning as I become closer to my NOMA colleagues like Jason and Dr. Daniels, and learning more from William. My experience was very different from theirs. And I do appreciate everything that Lawrence Tech has done. It's been a major part of my career, having gone there through 3 degrees and then becoming an adjunct professor there. My experience in learning about culture in architecture and what is deemed as beautiful architecture and who are the important architects and who's shaped our profession over the years. I had never seen anyone Black. I had never had a Black professor. I had not met a Black architect until I met Rainey Hamilton, who gave me my first job here in Detroit. And those things, just representation and the saying, you can't be what you can't see, are just very true. And I think because our educational system and our profession is heavily dominated by people who don't look like us, it is really up to everyone to make sure that that experience for students, whether they're at a PWI or at an HBCU, students are exposed to different cultures and different types of architecture that are important, and not just one of European descent. I do very specifically remember through all my theory classes and history classes, that is what I learned about. And although those things are important, they are not the only representation of architecture out there. And so those are the types of experiences that I can remember. I do know that I sometimes had a feeling that was I being broken down to possibly choose another profession? There were times where I was discouraged to switch to something else. And you know, that's just, I wouldn't imagine something like that happening to other students who did not look like me. I mean, there were some cases where it was obviously because of that reason. And because of my determination to go back and rebuild my community and give back to my city and just be the face that I was looking for growing up, especially in terms of the built environment where students like me live and learn, and the exclusion that we face in those settings alone, let alone what we experience in college. But I'm at home or at school in an urban city where these spaces are already discouraging. Like the creativeness that I had within me was not nurtured by that. And so for me to have these things that Dr. Daniels described, I always wonder what my experience would have been like had I attended an HBCU. And I think it's very important the way that things are taught at HBCUs, which William will touch on shortly. But yeah, those are the things that I remember constantly asking myself, am I strong enough? Am I smart enough? Is this right for me? Because I was missing that. And I think the thick skin that I developed just growing up in the environment that I was in really helped me to just remain resilient and stick it out, and here I am. So it's just a little nutshell of my experience.
Thank you, Tiffany. It's really helpful, I think, to put all of this into context and to see the differences that students have in their start out in the beginning, and how that maybe influences where they go with their education. So I want to now turn to William as the most recently graduated of our panel members. William, if you would please talk a little bit about your experience as a student at Florida A&M, and then tell us what the NOMA Foundation Fellowship experience has been for you this past few months.
Okay. Hopefully I'm not all over the place because I do have a lot of thoughts on this topic as well. Luckily, even before college, I was involved in an academy in high school that was basically an academy for design, manufacturing, technology, and that was basically what introduced me to this possible career field. Being exposed to this was not typical for somebody like myself, a Black young man in Daytona Beach. We were more so exposed to sports and other things that wasn't professional or such. But being exposed to that actually gave me a little spark as to what I could do other than football. But I can't say the same for many of my peers, because luckily I was very self-aware from a young age. So being able to realize kind of my strengths and weaknesses, that helped guide me as far as what I could do other than the possibility of football. But compared to my experience at FAMU, I would say the interaction between the mentor, instructor, professor was a lot, I would say a lot less forced versus when I was at FAMU. Not to say that that was a good or bad thing, but in reality, I honestly just made it harder on myself because it was easier to seek help and knowledge from the internet and books rather than taking the time out to go to a professor's office. And although most of the professors was great, there were some specific professors who kind of deterred me and had me not wanting to actually seek help from professors. I also did still look to certain people who I had a specific relationship with, but it wasn't a overall experience in FAMU. After realizing that I kind of had trouble voicing my own thoughts and opinions on architecture during like class meetings, interactive discussions with visiting speakers, and more importantly, crits, I felt as though I initially just chose the wrong degree to pursue. And even after becoming aware of these shortcomings and trying to improve upon them, I still couldn't quite tie it in with the subject matters that I was discussing. Um, even even as I wrote down the things that I needed to talk to, I still in the moment became flustered and didn't quite perform how I wanted to. Although my work did speak for itself and I was still granted A's and B's and passing grades, I still knew I had a ton of work to do if I wanted to actually feel fully comfortable with anything architectural that was thrown my way. Now, don't get me wrong, although I was very self-aware of these shortcomings, I also began realizing where the school itself needed some slight improvement and better preparing us for the next phase out of college. After my own self-evaluation during my junior year, I began to look at a lot of things differently and also began to look at almost everything as a lesson and something to be learned, even if it wasn't architectural. That's when a lot of things started to make more sense to me, and the why became more apparent in a lot of the things that were done the way they were. I started to question how schools prepared their students for the real world, why firms weren't choosing specific candidates, and why we learned what we was taught. And trying to figure out those differences in other schools and FAMU. After that, the more questions I asked, the better grasp I had on what I could do to position myself based on some of these factors that I couldn't control. And I noticed from a more practical standpoint that we weren't really learning or practicing most of the things that we would have to know early on as a role as an aspiring architect. Of course, we knew we had to know the history, philosophies, and methods of the methods to the madness, but usually that excluded what we would actually be looked at to do coming straight off of graduation. Essentially, we learn from basically the end point of the practice instead of kind of learning just the beginning fundamental. And without knowing that a lot of things could go basically over your head once you're actually in a firm, because you might not learn the same way the system sets you up to learn. And as everybody knows, a lot of the systems in place as far as educational, social, and political has always not been basically made for people of color. So this is just another instance of how we can basically, this is just another instance of how even if we do have the resources available to compete, we still have to basically work 10 times harder because for one, we're working in a generally white male dominated industry. And for the most part, it's kind of difficult for even the most progressive principals and industry executives to fully and successfully get to know and genuinely understand a Black person's point of view, while at the same time allowing him to be fully genuine with himself in the firm. And that disconnection plays into the staggering fact that Black architects are only 2% of the entire profession. So if we can begin to actually do that, we can kind of begin to also influence social equity in just general day-to-day activities and things of that sort.
So I want to go. We actually have there's a question in the Q&A that. But William, you kind of brought that back in, and we see a little bit as well. Tiffany, you talked about how the context that you grew up in and existed in was the sort of, we'll say, struggling urban environment or disinvested urban environment was kind of a spark for your creative energy. And so I wanted to ask, you know, all of you to maybe talk a little bit about, and particularly William, if that helped or would encourage you and your sort of your creative endeavors to look at this really, you know, to sort of change focus and say, this is actually where we need to be working, because these are the communities that need us the most in some of the ways that Dr. Daniels was speaking of.
William, I'd like for you to chime in on that first.
I would say that basically, the actual things that could help is getting to the certain demographic as far as people of color. I think getting to them early on, like mainly during like high school and that kind of age, I think being able to show them an example of how a person who looks like them can navigate the space and the success that they're doing, the impact they're creating, and how basically they can use their voice and their just natural talents and abilities to influence change and positive change that they can actually see, touch, and just be proud of themselves for. Because a lot of the things that people of color are kind of shown and introduced to isn't what actually will help the overall picture as far as just the general well-being of people in general. And being able to catch them at an early age would actually help them and expand their minds as well as the minds of children in the future, and help them see themselves in a different light than what we're usually accustomed to.
Yeah, you know, Tiffany, I know it was kind of directed with you, and I'm going to let you respond, but I'm immediately thinking of, you know, both our architectural project pipeline, architectural camp that we host during the summers, which is geared towards middle school students and high school students, and also the annual student design competition, and the sites that we typically select, and the community partners that we partner with when we do those projects every year. Just really quickly, and Tiffany will probably dive into this more, the architectural camps that we host via Project Pipeline in the summer, these are multi-day camps with middle school students, 6th, 7th, 8th graders, early high school students, where we really teach them about space and scale, about design. Because if you think about design, design is everywhere. Design is everything, and it's not until you actually realize that, you know, there's a design component to everything around you in the physical space where you really start to take notice and really start to appreciate design, right? And so part of it is just that initial conversation with students, opening their eyes up to the world around them. And we do that by introducing them to scale, how they interact with space, right? And we kind of move them up through a series of multiple days where we initially have the students design something that they know, something that's easy, right? A house, their home, whatever it may be. And so they spend that first day designing a house, and they can wrap their heads around that pretty quickly. Even 6th graders can do that pretty quickly. And then the next day, we have the students team up and they actually partner with other students, and they build a community amenity space or building, whether that's a grocery store, a fire station, a school, a rec center, whatever that may be. 3rd day, they come together with a larger team, they design a skyscraper. And then on the 4th day, we take all of these models that they've built over the last few days, and we have them build a city, and we actually teach him about context and scale and infrastructure and transportation, circulation, those type of things, open space and the public realm. So it's really, really just thorough camp. And it's amazing to see these students as they jump from scale to scale, really their eyes open up in terms of how they see their space. The last thing is that I was also mentioning was the student design competition, which is it's the Barbara G. Laurie Student Design Competition, which is hosted every year during the annual NOMA conference. And it started out with 4 or 5 schools competing during the NOMA conference, and it has exploded. Tiffany, I think maybe we had less than just around 40 maybe student teams that participated last year from all over the country. And it is always tied to the host city where we're hosting the chapter, the conference. So last year it was in Oakland. This year it will be in Detroit, where we'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary of the organization. And once again, we are asking all the students to really spend some time diving into and researching a very segregated and marginalized community in Detroit, which is in much need of resources and infrastructure and programming, successful programming. And so the students are indeed, I think, engaged and pulled into this space and this larger conversation about context and impact and the things that they can have, that they have control over the built environment. Tiffany, I wasn't trying to steal your shine on that, but those are 2 things that immediately jumped to my mind as William was expounding upon his own experiences.
Yeah, and those are all important to make, because just tying your comment and William's comment together, it's all about exposure as an early access. And it's something that was missing from my experience growing up. And so now that those resources are available, it's definitely something that we need to share. It's something that is NOMA branded and is working well. I'm part of that effort of growing the student chapters from my previous position as a Midwest University liaison. But I wanted to just quickly touch on the question in the chat, and I'll reread it just to make sure that I'm understanding it. I find this question of the creative flow within not matching the urban environment around you to be super proactive and relevant for those of us working in struggling urban environments. How can we help nurture this creative energy in our students? So there are a couple points. I'm often asked this question, being someone who is from Detroit, and we are experiencing quite the resurgence that is mostly excluding the people who made the city what it is and the culture what it is. And so working in my field and with the camps that I've hosted with Project Pipeline and Urban Arts Collective and 400 Forward, there are a couple points that I just wanted to bring up, and I touched on these throughout my response earlier. Seek out points of exclusion. Those points of exclusion, whether it be exposure or even financial barriers, I think that's the first approach in an urban environment, especially one like Detroit, where people are very proud and resistant to someone flying in with a cape as if they already have the answers and already have the knowledge of what that city needs. It would not work with students or people in the community. The next point I wanted to make is to identify situational challenges. I think all 3 or 4 of us on this call have expressed these types of things that occur on a situational, as situational biases. So consider the context in which people interact with spaces. Is the design experience accessible to them, or is it like, what are those points of exclusion? I had not even been to a college campus when I started at Lawrence Tech. It's shocking, I know, but it was just not something, coming from where I'm from and coming from a family of people who did not make it to college. That's something that is a situational challenge to identify. But what types of things do those students face? A lot of the professors just kind of go on with their curriculum and go on with the way that they teach as if those things didn't exist. And there might be students in your class that have never been there, that don't know what a design studio is, do not know how to present a project. That was me. I identify with you, William, on that. Had a great project, But when it was time to present this project, I had no training on doing that, you know, so I was kind of thrown into the fire to figure that out. Provide equivalent experiences. And again, these points are just some findings that are in a book called Mismatch: How Inclusion Shapes Design, in my chapter Within 4. And these are the points that I'm bringing out, and I always like to share them. Providing equivalent experiences and recognizing personal biases. As I just mentioned, a lot of the built environment of our cities kind of reflect the designer's own abilities and assumptions of what that city needs. So I would first address that, and then finally extend the solution to everyone. So there's a quote that I like to share by a young actress named Yara Shahidi, and it says, "If a child grows up never seeing themselves represented as successful or as the hero, then they are the anomaly if they succeed and the expectation if they fail." I always use that as a tool of motivation whenever I'm speaking to kids in these neighborhoods where they're often referred to as a disadvantaged youth. I have been that youth. It is discouraging. And I would just like to ask that we use more nurturing approaches to people in neighborhoods, to students in college. All of these things play a major factor where they'll end up like William and possibly deciding against this profession. And luckily for him, he was paired with a mentor like Steve Lewis as EGF. So Steve Lewis has been a mentor to all 4 of us. And I hope that answers your question. And I can be reached at tiffany.brown@noma.net if anyone would like to expand on any of those things.
So I really want to thank you all. And unfortunately, our time is come to a close. We could continue this conversation for a long time because there's so many dimensions to it. I have a long list of questions that I would love to ask William as someone who teaches lots of freshmen. You know, what could I have said that would spark somebody's interest and actually get them through the door of my office, or you know, up to the front of the class at the end to ask me that question that they wanted to ask. But I for another time, William, we'll chat about that. So thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you and to prepare for this session. And we have so many more opportunities to continue to these discussions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes.